So back by popular demand, back to the Silver Studios, UHS Remote Learning. And I've got my Eddie Van Halen shirt on. I'm ready to rock on. If any of you ask me who Eddie Van Halen is, you're dead to me. Look him up if you need to. I know I'm old, but he is the best ever. So moving forward. Also, keep in mind as we take a journey through this wonder that is remote learning, keep in mind that you should be thankful for one thing in particular, and that's the fact that you have got me and you don't have Barbudo. If you had Barbudo, you'd be totally stuck right now. So you're welcome for that. So we're going to continue on with U.S. Reconstruction numero tres. So where we left off was the war is over, and Reconstruction has finally taken place after a number of plans went in and out of Congress trying to figure out the right way to go about things. The radicals and Lincoln went at it, and then Lincoln was assassinated, and the radicals and Johnson went at it, and they tried to impeach him. And finally, they came up with a plan in 1867 that divided the Confederacy into 5 parts, put a military general in charge of all of them, and tried to keep the Confederates pretty much in place as the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and all of the new civil rights for the newly freed slaves was starting to take place. So now we're looking at Chapter 12, Section 3, Birth of the New South. Even though blacks were now free, it was clear that they did not have any freedoms, or not many freedoms at least. As an example, many did not have the money to buy land. So even though you had the right to buy land, obviously you needed the capital to be able to do so, and many of them didn't have this. Even if they had money, most people would not sell to them anyway. They still looked at them as slaves. They didn't want them as neighbors. They didn't want them to have power. Owning property was power. So they wanted to keep them off the land as much as possible. The New South was emerging as a new Southern economy. The ending of slavery with the 13th Amendment caused more questions than it actually answered. For example, who would now work the plantations? Would the main crop still be cotton? Would free blacks leave or stay in the South? And how would poor whites be affected? So let's take a quick look at all of these. So who would work the plantations? Well, what's the labor source going to be during this time? Foreigners never went to the South because the jobs were never there. So you're probably going to be looking at the poor whites or the freed slaves, but that brings you down to question number 3. Would free blacks leave or would they stay in the South? So this part always reminds me of a scene in Schindler's List, which I obviously believe deals with the Holocaust, but there was a scene at the end of Schindler's List when the Jews had been liberated by the Russians. And they looked at the guy who was saying that you are liberated now and said, "Where do we go?" And he said, "Well, I wouldn't go east because they hate you there, and I wouldn't go west either if I were you." Well, the freed slaves were kind of in a similar bind here. Could they go north? Sure, but racism in the north was just as bad as it was in the South. Could they go west? Yes, but there isn't much out there, and it's very, very dangerous. These are things we talked about in the previous section. So who is going to do the actual work? Well, it's going to come down to the poor whites and the freed slaves and go on from there, and competing for the jobs at this point. Would the main crop still be cotton? Another thing they had to take into consideration, did they still have the cotton markets? The British had gone to India and other parts of the world to get their cotton now, so would they still be able to do that? The other problem is that cotton depletes the land. I mean, it's just terrible on the soil. It just sucks all the nutrients right out of it, and these people were just planting and planting and planting. They weren't using the 3-field system like it was done in feudal times, where you could save some acres for another season and so on. So it was just ravaging the land at this point. It was just terrible. And then the fourth question, how would poor whites be affected? Would they be worse off? Would they be better off? If more of the freed slaves moved away, would that mean more work for them and a better lifestyle? So these are all questions that have to be answered going forward. So first of all, plantation owners couldn't find labor. It was very hot and difficult work. And I have to tell you, after having a small garden in Uxbridge for a few years, it sucks. It is the worst work in the world, especially if it's hot out. It's constant weeding, it's constant fertilizing. You have to keep watering it. You have to constantly check on it. You have to see if there's bugs. You have to see if there's disease, and you have to come up with a way to get rid of those. And it's just really, really hard work. But then on top of it, the railroad was now being built across the nation, and that paid triple. So if we look at the Transcontinental Railroad for a second, one of the things that the Union made sure of was that the Transcontinental Railroad that they've been trying to pass for quite a while would get passed for the northern part of the country. And the reason why that happened is because the Confederacy had seceded. So with no Democrats from the South in Congress, it was easily passed in Congress that the Transcontinental Railroad that would attach pretty much the Missouri, Iowa area here all the way across to California. So now you could take the railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast, which changed everything. But obviously that meant labor. And you had many, many people that went out to the West to do this backbreaking work. But if you're going to do backbreaking work and you're going to deal with weather and animals and disease and so on, you might as well get paid triple for what you would have been doing working on a plantation back home. So the railroad really depleted the labor source for the South during this time. And like we said before, blacks could do the work, but oftentimes had no land, either because they didn't have the money or people wouldn't sell to them anyway. So a new form of farming called sharecropping came about. In sharecropping, the landowner, usually still the plantation owner, would give a family a piece of land that they could farm. They would do all the work, they would put all of the effort into it and so on, and then they would only get about a third of the crops as payment. And not to confuse you on that, what I mean to say is that the landowner who didn't do any of the work but just owned the land would take a third of the crops as payment for letting them have the land. But they would also provide housing. Now, the housing was probably nothing significant. It was probably just a shack. But the problem was, is even though the people that did all the work had to keep 2/3 of the crops, that was never going to be enough for them to be able to pay off their debt. Some owners charged rent for the housing, so the family could never ever get out of debt. They could not leave until they were out of debt, or they would be legally hunted down. There were laws that allowed bounty hunters to go find people if they left the land without paying off their debt in total. Some owners even evicted the family after the crops were picked without paying them anything. The process of sharecropping was a new legal form of slavery. Maybe the worst thing about this was that if a father got into this sharecropping agreement with the owner, if he could not pay off the debt at the time of his death, that meant that his children were now under the same debt. And they could live in that sharecropping situation for their entire life. And if they never got out of debt, that meant that their children may have to stay there legally and they could never leave, which is why it does feel like it's kind of a form of slavery. Now, if you could swing it, tenant farming was a better way of going about it. It was a different form of landowning that if a family earned enough money, they could actually rent the land from the owner. And what that would mean is if they paid cash to the landowner, they wouldn't have to pay him the crops, which means that whatever plants or any crops that they planted, they could keep. They could use for themselves, they could sell it at a profit, and they had a much better chance of making some money and some profits off of tenant farming. But many people could not afford to be able to do that kind of deal. Some of the changes that occurred in Southern farming. First of all, there were many more white laborers after the Civil War. One of the reasons probably would be that you had a number of soldiers that were coming back from the war looking for jobs. Much of the factories, or any factories that the South had, were probably destroyed. And if they had farms of their own, there were many poor white farmers during that time. Their land was probably gone at this point. The Union came down and did a lot of destroying. They took a lot of land away from people to give it to the former slaves. So they were probably looking for labor. So many white people looking for jobs would now become laborers. People grew more cash crops, cotton and tobacco, instead of food crops. Again, not a smart decision. You're going to make more money off of cotton and tobacco by far. But if you're not having people grow food, how are your people in the South going to live? How are they going to be able to survive? Well, the only way that you can do that is you have to import the food. And if you're going to import it, oftentimes from the North probably, that means you have to pay money for it, which means you're going to have to work harder for it. Most families, white and black, remained in debt, and they couldn't break out of that cycle. That's something that probably a lot of us in this day and age can kind of relate to. The amount of debt that we have present day is just through the roof. It's off the charts. Everybody has credit cards. Everybody has mortgages. Everybody has car payments. Look at the student loans that are going on now. We know what debt is. But for us, it seems to be a little bit easy to deal with, at least at this point in time. Back then, if you were in debt, you could lose everything. If you owed people money, they could take you to court and take what little you had. This year's money went to last year's bills. That's the way things were done back then. A wealthy middle class or merchants class emerged. Many were honest shop owners who sold supplies to tenant farmers, but some of them were landlords that opened shops and forced tenants to buy things at higher prices. So as an example, if you were the landowner and you had given out your money to the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers, you may open up a store that would sell them goods, and you may force them to buy the goods from your store. And of course, you're going to jack up the prices to things that they can never afford, or at least be very, very tough for them to afford. And make no mistake about this, debt is power. If someone owes you a debt, you control them. You control almost everything about them. And there weren't a whole lot of laws back there as far as looking out for the consumer or people who got into bad deals. Lawyers are not always available. Like nowadays, there are people who will do pro bono work to get you out of a situation if you don't have the money. Back then, that usually wasn't the case. If you got into a bad deal, you were stuck, and that's it. Some Southerners traveled to the North and saw how industry had grown, and cities grew also because of it. So it's not that there wasn't any industry in the South, and they probably learned their lesson from the Civil War. When they saw how the Union troops were supplied, they always had clothing, they always had food, they had so much more when it came to railroad and industry and so on, that the South probably felt like they needed to catch up a little bit. So they wanted to do the same thing in the South as much as they could. Atlanta. You may remember that Sherman burned Atlanta to the ground right before his destructive path to the sea to Savannah. But Atlanta was rebuilt right away. Along with that, railroads were rebuilt, about 3,300 miles in the Confederacy, or the old Confederacy. And many of the towns that were down there turned into cities. And this goes right along with the industrialization that we were just talking about. If industry comes to these places, that means that the cities are going to grow. So Richmond, Virginia, Nashville, Tennessee, Louisville, Kentucky, Memphis, Tennessee, Little Rock, Arkansas, Montgomery, Alabama, Charlotte, North Carolina, Dallas, Texas, Houston, Texas, and Fort Worth, Texas, all now big places on the map. Most Southern factories dealt with unfinished products like pig iron and cotton. Now, the pig iron could go on to make some decent money for them going forward, because one of the big products that is right around the corner is steel. And Andrew Carnegie is going to make an empire out of this. So it's possible that if you got into pig iron, that you may have some money in your future. Not finished product like furniture. They didn't do a whole lot of that down there. That was something more for the North. Most of the industry down South was things that you could make things out of. They did grow, but now, I should say not, but not as large as the Northern industries. They had a ways to go before that would happen. The primary place that Reconstruction money went to was infrastructure. And what infrastructure means, it's any public property and services that people use. Back then, it would have been primarily bridges, roads, railroads, canals, and telegraph lines. Think about, what it would be like to get around Uxbridge if we didn't have bridges here. Just drive around some point. You will go over or under a bridge at some point. Try to picture what it would be like if you didn't have that bridge there. How would you get to the other side? What would you have to do? Railroads, obviously a big thing. You know, living in Uxbridge, we know a decent amount about canals, you know, the towpath and the Blackstone River Canal and so on. But when the railroads were built and the Worcester-Providence line was put in, that made the canals from the 1820s obsolete pretty quickly, which was a good investment at the time, but the railroads just torched them by the time it was done. Telegraph lines, huge game changer. Before the telegraphs were put in, if you wanted to get some kind of message to somewhere else in the country, it was going by boat or horse or wagon or some mix of the three, and it may or may not get there, and it may take months to get there. With a telegraph line, you could get your message there in minutes if you wanted to. But unfortunately, the Civil War destroyed almost everything, especially down in the Confederacy. So everything that was infrastructure down there would have to be rebuilt. They also started to build public schools. The Confederacy started to look a little bit more at education as something that was beneficial. The North had always known about public schools. Massachusetts and Horace Mann and so on, we were kind of at the forefront of that in the nation. But down south, they were about farming, and the kids didn't have time to go to school. And if they did go to school, it was only if it was a time period when they weren't needed to work on the crops. But they started to build some more public schools. Taxes were increased to pay off a lot of the heavy debts at this point. So you can imagine how the Confederates, I keep calling them Confederates, but now they're Southern United States. You can imagine what it must be like for them to come off a loss of a civil war. Many of them have lost their land. Their industry and the farms are shot, and now they're going to increase the tax on them to pay off these heavy debts. Reconstruction was hampered by corruption, and that's always going to be a thing. Wherever there's money, especially government money that's being handed out, there is going to be corruption. Many politicians get into that line of work just for this. They know that they can make money. So politicians and businessmen use millions of dollars for their own personal gain. I can remember reading stories about some of the Reconstruction money that went down to Georgia. There was one guy that gambled it almost all on horses at the horse races, and then another guy redid his own office in the state capitol. And nobody was there to make sure that the money was being used for the reason it was set out for. So all this money went down there, and a lot of stuff did not get done. That was going to leave the South in debt and in terrible shape for years to come. Obviously, this is going to hurt Reconstruction progress. And that's chapter 3. So when we come back for section 4 and we finish up the chapter, we'll get into the human reaction to all of these changes. And as you can imagine, it's not going to be good. We're going to talk about the emergence of the Klan, which was a direct reaction to the rights of the blacks that were newly freed, trying to take them away. And even some things up in the North. Corruption was not just a Southern thing, it was a Northern thing too. So when we get into section 4, we'll get into that a little bit more, and we'll finish up the chapter and go from there. Appreciate your attention, guys. We'll see you soon.